Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the Orwellian gatekeepers of frontier AI knowledge. We're going to dive into a massive geopolitical shift that starts with a surprisingly relatable consumer problem and follow it all the way to a profound debate over our global infrastructure. Let's get right into it.
So, let's set the stage here. A prominent AI safety lab recently released what you can really only describe as a mythos-level frontier model. I mean, it absolutely shattered existing performance benchmarks. You think developers would be throwing a parade, right? Well, actually, the rollout instantly triggered a massive developer backlash, and it all boils down to one incredibly simple question hovering over the release. Are you actually getting the AI you paid for?
Now, what's really fascinating about this is the secret degradation. Picture this. You're paying full price for this top-tier advertised capability, but then you find out your actual experience has been secretly downgraded, or, as the community calls it, nerfed. Users discover that if their prompts touched on complex subjects like frontier AI research, machine learning, or chip design, the provider would silently nerf their access, quietly routing them to a significantly less powerful model. In some cases, prompts were literally rewritten in the background without any notification at all, while customers were still being charged full price.
And it wasn't just individual developers getting burned. This brilliantly illustrates how enterprise trust was just completely fractured overnight. You see, previously these massive enterprise clients operated under strict zero data retention agreements. Their proprietary inputs were kept totally secure. But then, almost out of nowhere, the lab overrode those agreements and forced a new, universal 30-day minimum retention policy on all prompts and contexts. Talk about a massive bait and switch.
So, what does this all actually mean?
Well, developers are looking at these top-tier AI providers and realizing they've basically morphed into, and this is a direct quote here, Orwellian gatekeepers. They are unilaterally deciding who is worthy of accessing these frontier capabilities. And for a business, that creates a severe, almost existential vulnerability. Imagine building your entire software stack on a platform, knowing you could be unpredictably cut off or censored at any moment without warning. Section 2, the industry shift, escaping to open source. Let's look at the next layer of impact here and see how these micro-user frustrations are actively driving a massive industry-wide flight toward open source technology.
Because honestly, these sweeping safety policies and broad guardrails are just so incredibly unpredictable. They are actually accelerating this open source migration because they end up blocking perfectly legitimate scientific work. For instance, researchers doing highly specialized molecular predictions have had their vital projects halted simply because the AI blindly flagged their work as a hypothetical bioweapon. No, really. This level of unreliability is literally forcing companies to host and run open source models locally just to keep their businesses functioning.
But the closed source labs aren't just sitting back and watching this happen. Critics argue they are intentionally fighting back by pushing for strict government intervention, specifically calling for an FDA-style regulatory framework. And let's be clear, this isn't out of pure altruism. It's exactly what we call regulatory capture. By lobbying for intense regulations that are essentially impossible for decentralized developers to comply with, these leading corporations are trying to create a massive legal moat deliberately designed to kill off smaller open-source competition.
And that dynamic introduces a truly fascinating geopolitical risk. If Western AI platforms over-restrict their own users and successfully regulate away domestic open-source competition, well, where do the developers go? A major concern raised in the source material is that, right now, the highest-performing open-source alternatives are actually originating out of China. Global developers will simply migrate to wherever the most capable technology remains open.
However, escaping to open source isn't quite as simple as just downloading a file. We are hitting a dramatic infrastructure brick wall here. Look at this comparison. While traditional IT required relatively low capital and legacy data centers are medium, building the massive frontier data centers required to truly scale these open source alternatives demands astronomical funding. We're talking surging into the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. That's just a mind-boggling amount of money. Which means that even in the open source world, power is rapidly consolidating among an incredibly tiny group of heavily funded players who can actually afford the hardware.
Section 3, the societal reckoning. Should the public own AI? This massive consolidation of power and capital really forces us to pull back to the macro level and examine a profound societal debate regarding the public ownership of artificial intelligence.
A recent high-profile legislative proposal tackles this head-on, suggesting that the public should actually own half of major AI corporations through a sovereign wealth fund. The core rationale they're using? The seizure of public knowledge. These incredibly lucrative models didn't just magically appear out of thin air. They were trained entirely for free on our collective human data. Humanity's music, thousands of years of literature, open source code, all of it utilized to build these massive corporate systems without a single dime of compensation back to the public.
And this debate is really fueled by some wildly conflicting messages coming straight from AI leaders. On one hand, executives are constantly warning the public about a looming job apocalypse, massive future workforce job losses. But then, on the flip side, the real-world business application reveals this massive productivity boom where companies are aggressively hiring to build entirely new products that were previously impossible. Seeing these huge corporate gains right alongside warnings of public job losses has prompted everyday citizens to logically ask, wait a second, what exactly is in this deal for me?
Beyond just the data, proponents also point to a massive infrastructure argument for state equity. You see, unlike the early days of the internet where replicating software essentially costs zero, AI acts much more like heavy industry. It demands an immense, ongoing tax on physical infrastructure. We're talking massive GPU deployments and incredibly intense electricity usage. It literally relies on the resilience of our public power grids. Because AI rides so heavily on this public infrastructure, they argue state equity is a lot like historical private transportation networks that were built on top of government-funded rails.
So we've traced this whole journey today. We've seen how a surprisingly simple micro-issue, like a secretly downgraded developer prompt, ripples outward. It fractures enterprise trust, drives a massive shift toward open source models, sparks very real fears of regulatory capture, and ultimately connects all the way to the physical power grids of our planet. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If the frontier of artificial intelligence relies completely on our collective, unpaid data to learn, and our public electrical grids to run, who really owns the future?